Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I had spent 3 full days preparing for this dinner, scrubbing every inch of my house, polishing the silverware I barely ever used, carefully arranging place cards like it would somehow make me feel like I finally belonged at the head of the table. The turkey had been brined overnight, the table was set with fresh pine garland, flickering candles, and cloth napkins folded into little trees that I'd watched 4 YouTube tutorials to perfect. I'd even placed a small bell on each plate, because somewhere in my head I believed that if everything looked perfect enough, maybe the people sitting around it would act like a family for once. The scent of cinnamon, cloves, and rosemary filled the house, masking the underlying tension that had been growing in my chest since the moment I woke up. This was the first time I was hosting Christmas dinner, something I had insisted on doing, even begged for, because somewhere deep inside me I believed it was my chance to prove that I could hold things together just as well as my sister Rachel ever could. Maybe even better, if only anyone in this family ever cared enough to notice. The doorbell rang precisely at 4, right on schedule, and the chaos began the moment I opened it. Rachel stepped inside first, wrapped in a cashmere coat that probably cost more than my dining chairs, followed by her husband, Nathan, who looked bored already, and their 2 picture-perfect children, who immediately began comparing the gifts under my tree to the ones they'd seen at her house. Behind them came my mother and father, Linda and Gerald, still dressed like they were attending a country club brunch instead of a cozy holiday dinner with family. My mother's eyes scanned the room the way a realtor sizes up a fixer-upper, and my father gave me a quick pat on the shoulder before heading straight for the liquor tray without a word. I smiled so hard my jaw hurt, offering wine, pointing out the appetizers, complimenting outfits I secretly hated, and pretending not to notice when Rachel subtly repositioned the centerpiece I'd carefully arranged earlier that afternoon. She walked around my house like she owned the walls, making comments about how charming everything was, charming, of course, being her favorite word when something wasn't quite up to her standards, but she wanted to sound polite. "You've really done a lot with the space," she said, running a perfectly manicured finger along the edge of the mantel, as if dust was the measure of love. Dinner was still an hour away, and I was already exhausted. Every time I tried to start a conversation, Rachel redirected it back to herself, her latest business trip, her kids' achievements, or some vague story about how her neighbor asked her for decorating tips again. My father barely said a word, nodding through her stories like he was just glad someone was talking, and my mother made small, sharp remarks about how I must have been so brave to try cooking for everyone, because hosting a holiday meal, apparently, was something only accomplished women were expected to survive. I excused myself to check on the roast, but really I just needed a moment to breathe, to remind myself that I was doing something good, that it didn't matter what they said or didn't say, that the effort was still mine and it still mattered. I stood there for a full minute in the kitchen, eyes closed, hands pressed against the edge of the counter, trying to push away the hollow ache forming behind my ribs. And then I heard her footsteps. I turned around just in time to see my mother walk in, closing the kitchen door behind her with a softness that always meant something was coming. I straightened up immediately, trying to smile again, even though my face felt tight from holding it too long. She looked at me for a moment, just looked, like she was trying to decide how much honesty she wanted to let loose before dessert, and then she sighed, shaking her head slightly like she pitied me for trying so hard. "You can put all the effort in the world into this," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "But you'll always be second to your sister, no matter what you do." I don't know what I expected her to say, but it wasn't that. Not that blunt, not that cruel, not when I had just spent days trying to make something beautiful out of a family that never really treated me like part of it. I looked at her, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something softer in her eyes, like regret or even sadness, but it disappeared before I could be sure. I smiled. That's all I did. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, didn't cry. I just smiled and nodded like her words hadn't left a crater in my chest. Then I turned back to the oven, pretending to check the roast, pretending I hadn't just been reminded, yet again, that in this house, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be enough. And somewhere deep inside me, something shifted. Something solid and cold and sharp began to form quietly in the space where hope used to live. Because if I was always going to be second, I figured it was finally time to stop playing nice. I walked back into the dining room with my head high and my lips curved into the kind of smile you only learn to perfect when you've spent a lifetime swallowing disappointment like dry pills. The roast was ready, the sides were warm, the candles were flickering just right, and if you didn't know any better, you'd have thought I was the happiest woman in the room. But behind my smile, my mother's words were still echoing, each syllable digging deeper into the parts of me that I had tried so hard to protect. You'll always be second to your sister, no matter what you do. And just like that, every polished surface in the house felt a little duller, every carefully arranged centerpiece a little less charming, and every moment that followed tasted faintly of ash. Dinner began like any other family gathering, forks clinking against plates, napkins on laps, and a few scattered compliments that sounded more like observations than genuine praise. The roast was good, the potatoes weren't overdone, and no one had anything bad to say about the cranberry sauce, but still, there was that undercurrent of tension in the room, like everyone was waiting for something more impressive to happen. And it did, just not for me. Rachel stood up somewhere between the second glass of wine and the first bite of dessert, holding her glass with that performative grace she had mastered somewhere between her second promotion and her third Pilates certification. She smiled at everyone, thanked them for being there, and launched into what could only be described as a speech, one that sounded suspiciously like she was the host of the evening instead of a guest sitting in my damn dining room. "I'm just so grateful we could all come together this year," she said, her eyes sweeping across the table like she owned the space, like she had personally arranged every seat and lit every candle. "It's not easy to find time in our busy lives, and I know how much effort goes into making this holiday special." I waited, honestly waited, for her to say thank you to me, to acknowledge that I had cooked the food, that I had set the table, that I had vacuumed the carpet 3 times and steamed the drapes just so no one would say anything about the cat hair. But the thank you never came. Everyone just nodded, raised their glasses, and clinked them together like Rachel's words had sealed some sacred family bond. Even my father smiled proudly, lifting his glass a little higher than necessary, as if her speech had made him more proud than anything I'd ever said or done. I bit down on the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood, but still I smiled. I laughed politely when Rachel made a joke about the time we burned the turkey in college, even though it was my turkey and her distraction that ruined it. I nodded along when my mother chimed in with a story about Rachel winning the Christmas cookie competition at the church years ago, conveniently forgetting that I had come in second, again. My father raised his glass toward me at one point and said, "You did good, kid. Real good. This might be your thing after all." As if my ability to host a holiday dinner was some hidden talent that had just emerged out of nowhere, like I hadn't been feeding myself and others for years while Rachel was busy outsourcing her life to assistants and takeout services. And maybe it was the wine or maybe it was the years of being overlooked, but I started seeing everything around me through a new lens, like a movie I'd seen before but never really understood. Every smile from my mother was laced with some unspoken judgment. Every compliment from my father came with a shadow of surprise. Every nod from Rachel felt like permission rather than acknowledgement. And every word, every look, every tiny gesture was soaked in the same quiet message: "You're doing fine, but don't get ahead of yourself. You'll never be her." Have you ever tried to laugh through dinner while every comment aimed at you is dipped in sugar but meant to bruise? Have you ever looked around a room full of people who say they love you and realized they only know how to love the version of you that stays smaller than the one they truly fear? If you have, tell me in the comments, because I know I'm not alone. After dessert, I excused myself again, claiming I needed to find more candles for the windowsill, even though I knew damn well every candle in the house had already been lit. I needed a moment, a breath, a place to gather whatever fragments of dignity I had left before I cracked open in front of them. I stepped into the hallway and opened the side cabinet near the hallway bookshelf, intending only to grab a matchbox, but instead, my hand landed on something unexpected, a box I hadn't placed there. It was small and wrapped in glossy paper, too polished to be one of the gifts I had prepared, and as I pulled it out, I noticed a folded note taped to the top, addressed in my mother's handwriting. I paused, heart pounding, fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded the paper and read the first few lines. It wasn't for me. It was for Rachel. A private message meant to accompany the gift, something meant to be tucked in quietly after the bows were pulled and the wrapping paper tossed aside. But the words were what froze me in place. Just a little something to remind you that you'll always be my brightest light. You've made us proud every day of your life. Love, Mom. That was it. That was all it said. No frills, no metaphors, just the brutal simplicity of truth dressed as affection. And somehow, it was worse than all the toasts and all the smiles and all the half-assed compliments. Because that note wasn't meant to hurt me, but it did. Because it wasn't meant to be seen, but I saw it. And because it wasn't meant for me, but I had been carrying the weight of its message my entire life. I folded it slowly, slid it back under the ribbon, and closed the cabinet door as quietly as I could. I took one deep breath, then another, and then I smiled again. But this time, it wasn't the kind of smile they'd recognize. You'd think after so many years of being quietly compared, quietly dismissed, and quietly overlooked, a person would build up enough emotional scar tissue to stop caring entirely, but the truth is, it never really dulls. It just hardens in layers, year after year, until eventually even the good moments feel tainted by the anticipation of being undermined again. That's the thing no one ever really tells you about growing up in the shadow of someone else's spotlight. It doesn't just dim your own light, it warps the way you see yourself altogether. And no amount of carefully cooked dinners or Pinterest-worthy decorations can change the fact that sometimes love comes laced with resentment, especially when the love you've spent a lifetime craving was always handed, effortlessly, to someone else. I was maybe 6 or 7 the first time I noticed the way my mother's eyes lit up when Rachel walked into a room, like her presence alone made the air lighter, like she was the main character in every scene and I was simply part of the set design. Even back then, Rachel could do no wrong, not when she cut her own hair with kitchen scissors, not when she broke Mom's favorite vase, not even when she lied about cheating on a spelling test in the 3rd grade. Somehow, every mistake she made became a learning opportunity or a quirky phase, while any minor slip on my end turned into a lecture about responsibility and expectations. I remember once, I brought home a drawing I'd made in art class, a watercolor sunflower with petals that had taken me hours to paint just right. I showed it to my mother, practically vibrating with pride, only for her to glance at it for 2 seconds before saying, "That's nice, sweetheart, but Rachel painted a full landscape last week. Did you see hers?" And just like that, my joy crumpled faster than the paper it was painted on. That was always the story, me reaching for praise and Rachel being handed it without asking. In school, I worked twice as hard to get half the recognition, while Rachel could skate by on charm and half-finished homework assignments that teachers still praised because she had potential. When I got straight A's, my mother would say, "Of course you did, you're the quiet one," as if my effort was predictable and unimpressive. But when Rachel scraped together a B- in algebra, there'd be a celebratory dinner and a framed certificate on the fridge. And it didn't end in childhood. It followed us into adolescence, into adulthood, into every damn stage of life where I thought I might finally break even in her eyes. When Rachel flunked her first year of college, my parents covered it up like it never happened, sending her to Italy for a gap semester instead. When I earned my scholarship and worked 3 part-time jobs just to afford books and rent, my mother's only comment was, "Don't overdo it. You don't want to burn out too early." But the moment that lives in my mind like an old bruise was my college graduation. I had worked myself raw to get there, late nights, early mornings, skipped parties, missed holidays, all for that moment when I'd finally hear my name and walk across that stage. I had imagined my parents cheering, imagined my mother crying proud tears, imagined being enough for one day. And for exactly 15 minutes, I believed that was possible. Then Rachel stood up in the middle of the restaurant where we were supposed to be celebrating and announced she was pregnant. Suddenly, I wasn't the woman who just earned a degree. I was the aunt. Suddenly, every conversation shifted to baby names and nursery ideas and whether she'd move back home or stay with Nathan. My diploma stayed in its envelope on the edge of the table, untouched, unnoticed. My father ordered a second round of champagne, not for me, but for the growing life inside the one they already adored. I sat there smiling like I wasn't disappearing right in front of them, like it wasn't just another version of the same story I'd been living my whole life. So no, this dinner wasn't just about Christmas or decorations or roast turkey. It was about a history of being told, over and over again, that I would always be runner-up in a race I never signed up for but was expected to keep losing with grace. It was about watching Rachel take up space I was never allowed to fill and learning to pretend it didn't gut me every single time. It was about realizing that I could spend my whole life playing by their rules and still never be the daughter who mattered most. And just when I thought I had finally compartmentalized it all, finally pushed it down deep enough to survive one dinner without flinching, Rachel decided to twist the knife again. She leaned back in her chair, swirling the wine in her glass like she was hosting a damn talk show, and said, "It's really great to see you finally settling down into something that looks like success." I mean, who would have guessed, right? There was a beat of silence before the laughter erupted, my mother chuckling behind her napkin, my father giving that familiar nod, even Nathan smirking like it was all in good fun. No one even looked at me to check whether it landed the way she meant it to. And that was the worst part, they didn't have to. They already knew. But I smiled. I smiled so hard it almost cracked my teeth, because what none of them knew, what none of them even suspected, was that this dinner wasn't about proving anything to them anymore. It was about what came next. The scent of peppermint and pine still lingered in the air, mingling with the last traces of roasted garlic and cinnamon sugar, the kind of comforting holiday aroma that was supposed to wrap a home in warmth and nostalgia. But in that moment, all it did was remind me how well chaos could hide behind candlelight and perfectly folded napkins. After dessert had been cleared and the last few crumbs wiped from plates, I quietly stood up from the table and walked to the living room, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor like a clock ticking down to something none of them saw coming. Behind me, the chatter continued in low hums, Rachel giggling over some story about a ski trip gone wrong, my father pouring himself another splash of bourbon, my mother adjusting a decorative pillow that hadn't moved all evening. No one noticed the slight shift in my posture, the way I moved with a sense of intention now, the way my smile had settled into something more rigid, more rehearsed, more dangerous if you looked close enough. I picked up the basket where I had carefully arranged each small envelope, nothing flashy, no ribbons or glitter, just simple white cardstock with names written in dark ink, sharp and elegant and utterly unassuming. I brought them back into the dining room slowly, my fingers brushing lightly over each one, not out of nerves, but something colder, something calmer, like a surgeon preparing for an incision. The room went quiet as I placed the envelopes carefully in front of each seat, offering a gentle smile that didn't quite reach my eyes and a soft, pleasant, "Merry Christmas, everyone." They looked down, puzzled at first, expecting gift cards or heartfelt handwritten notes, or maybe some sentimental gesture wrapped in nostalgia, but none of them spoke. Not yet. They were still in the space between confusion and understanding, still trying to decode something they didn't know was already written in ink. I sat down again, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and waited. Rachel opened hers first, of course, because she always needed to be first to speak, first to be seen, first to pretend that nothing could ever touch her carefully curated sense of control. She pulled the card from the envelope, brows slightly furrowing as she scanned the page, and then her entire expression shifted, subtly, but enough for me to notice. It was a printed email exchange, dated 3 years ago, between her and a man who wasn't her husband, with subject lines that didn't leave much room for misinterpretation. I watched her face blanch, her lips part slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the paper. But she said nothing. Not a single word. She folded it back up, placed it quietly in her lap, and stared at me like she was seeing something unfamiliar for the first time. Next came my father. He chuckled as he opened his, clearly assuming it was a card with a heartfelt message or perhaps some clever little anecdote. But the moment his eyes scanned the page, his smile dropped like a curtain pulled too fast. It was a photocopy of a letter he had written, an old one, yellowed at the edges, from a time when I was no older than 10. In it, he had told a friend that he regretted not having 2 sons, said I was too sensitive, too soft, not the kind of daughter who'd ever make a mark on the world. I hadn't even known that letter existed until I found it in a box while helping him clean out the garage months ago. He looked up at me with wide eyes, stunned into silence, and for the first time in years, I saw something like shame in his face. My cousin opened hers next and found a journal entry I had written at 15, one that described in agonizing detail how she had ridiculed me at family gatherings, how her jokes had left scars no one ever noticed because they weren't physical. I knew she'd recognize the handwriting, knew she'd remember the words even before she finished reading them, because some truths don't fade even when they're buried in ink and dust. One by one, the envelopes were opened. Each contained a memory, a receipt, a truth that had been dismissed, denied, or buried for years. There were no accusations, no raised voices, just the quiet unraveling of carefully preserved facades. I hadn't written anything cruel. I hadn't fabricated a single word. I had simply returned what belonged to them, words they had said, choices they had made, moments they had tried to erase from the record. And I didn't have to say anything at all, because the room was doing the speaking for me now. The tension spread like smoke, slow and suffocating, settling over every candle flame and every strained smile. Rachel's husband leaned in and whispered something to her, his face unreadable. My cousin excused herself to the bathroom. My father poured himself another drink with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Only one envelope remained unopened, my mother's. It sat untouched on her plate, pristine and white, glowing faintly under the chandelier like a fuse waiting for a match. Everyone turned toward her slowly, eyes flicking between her stillness and the envelope she hadn't dared to reach for yet. She looked at it as if it might explode in her hands, as if the truth it contained would somehow be louder than every lie she had ever dressed in silk and silver. And still, she didn't move. So I leaned back in my chair, folded my arms slowly, and waited. Because I knew the moment would come. And when it did, everything else would go completely silent. The silence that settled over the room after I placed the last envelope was the kind of silence you don't hear often at family gatherings, the heavy kind, the kind that presses down on your chest like a weighted blanket soaked in secrets. No one was laughing anymore, no one was sharing stories, and the warm clatter of silverware and wine glasses had been replaced with an eerie stillness that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. I had expected some discomfort, maybe even a few awkward chuckles or dismissive comments, but what I hadn't anticipated was just how thoroughly the truth could rob a room of its voice. My father sat stiff in his chair, still holding the letter he had unfolded minutes earlier, his eyes darting between the lines on the page and the fireplace behind me as if hoping it would swallow him whole. The words on that paper weren't new to him, he had written them decades ago, but seeing them in print, held between his trembling hands, seemed to shake something in him that had never been rattled before. I remembered finding that letter in the attic, yellowed and tucked inside an old envelope addressed to a friend whose name I didn't even recognize. He had written it in the early days after my birth, telling this friend he was disappointed to have a second daughter and had hoped for a boy who might carry the family name with strength and pride. He ended the letter with a line that still rang in my ears. I'll raise her right, but I doubt she'll ever shine the way Rachel already does. He didn't say a word now. He didn't offer an apology or attempt a justification. He simply stared at the words he had written long ago, and for once, I let the silence do the talking for me. Rachel's envelope had been even more surgical in its precision. Her hands had shaken as she read it, her lips twitching as if fighting the urge to deny what was already laid bare in front of everyone. Inside her envelope had been a copy of her first set of divorce papers, documents she had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. She had spent years claiming her marriage to Nathan was her first, painting herself as the poster child for a perfect love story, but those papers told a very different tale. They told the story of a short-lived first marriage in her 20s, a husband she'd left after just 8 months, and a divorce quietly filed and sealed in another state before she met Nathan. It wasn't the divorce itself that mattered, it was the lie, the elaborate lie she had spun and maintained for years while everyone praised her commitment and envied her so-called perfect marriage. Nathan's face had been unreadable as he glanced over the document, his expression tight and his jaw clenched, and though he didn't say a word either, the way he shifted in his chair told me more than any argument ever could. Rachel had always believed that if she controlled the narrative, she could control her image, but secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them, especially when they're wrapped in a white envelope and handed to you with a polite smile. My cousin's envelope had included copies of old emails, nasty, dismissive things she had written about me to mutual friends, mocking my job, my appearance, my relationships. She had once called me the family charity case in a message she never thought I'd see. Another uncle received a transcript of a voicemail he left for my mother years ago, calling me a waste of a holiday seat after I'd declined a family gathering during a depressive spell. Every envelope, every note, every photocopy was a thread pulled from the fabric they'd all worked so hard to keep stitched together. And as it unraveled, I didn't gloat. I didn't yell. I didn't even blink. I just sat there, letting each of them drown quietly in the consequences of their own histories. But it was my mother who took the longest to open hers. She sat stone still, staring at the envelope like it might bite her if she reached for it. When she finally did, her fingers shook, and her lips pressed into a hard line as she pulled out a small stack of papers, old journal entries, printed from a notebook I had kept through my teenage years. Pages filled with the aftermath of every time she diminished me, ignored me, or used my pain as a way to uplift Rachel. There was also a photograph, a photo of her and Rachel at a women's award banquet I was never invited to, even though the same year I had won an academic award that went unacknowledged at home. Tucked behind the photo was a short note I had written and never sent, a letter addressed to her from years ago, filled with things I had never said out loud, my confusion, my grief, my exhaustion from always feeling like a placeholder in her life. She read it slowly, carefully, taking in every word, and then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. For a moment, I thought I saw something that resembled guilt, or maybe just recognition, but it vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Then she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, her hands shaking, but her voice sharp as ever. "How dare you," she said, her tone louder than anything else that had been spoken that evening. The room flinched at the sound of it, everyone turning toward her, waiting for a scene, a breakdown, some fiery confrontation that would somehow restore balance to this dinner gone wrong. But I stayed seated, calm as ever, hands folded neatly in my lap, and I met her eyes with a look she hadn't seen from me before, one that didn't beg for approval or recoil from her disapproval. "You gave me the template," I said, my voice low but steady. "I just followed the script you wrote." And then, the silence returned. The room had become quieter than it had been all night, the sort of silence that lingers after a storm, thick with unspoken thoughts and fragile pride, broken only by the soft rustling of coats and the awkward shuffle of chairs being pushed back from the table. No one dared to make eye contact anymore, and even the children, once noisy and full of sugar-fueled energy, now moved quietly behind their parents, sensing a shift in the air that no one wanted to name aloud. The family began to leave in slow, uncomfortable waves, some muttering half-hearted goodbyes, others disappearing through the front door without a glance back, as if hoping that a swift exit could somehow erase the weight of what they had just been handed. Rachel was among the last to rise, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she moved toward the kitchen under the pretense of helping clear the dishes, though I knew better than to believe that was her true intention. I followed her in silence, collecting the last few empty wine glasses and stacking plates I had no desire to wash, keeping my movement slow and deliberate, giving her time to speak first because I knew she would. I could feel the tension radiating off her in waves, the kind that comes from a bruised ego rather than genuine regret, and it didn't take long for her to turn and face me, arms crossed tightly over her chest like a barrier she hoped would keep her dignity intact. "You really think that was brave?" she said, her voice low but acidic, her words curling around the edges of the room like smoke from a dying flame. "Ruining dinner, humiliating everyone, dragging up things that didn't need to be said? That's not power, it's desperation wrapped in cheap theatrics." I didn't respond right away. I just kept stacking the plates, one after the other, letting the clink of porcelain fill the silence she left in her wake. I could have argued with her, could have thrown her own secrets back in her face or reminded her that no one forced her to live a lie for the sake of appearances, but I didn't. I'd spent too many years explaining myself to a family that never listened and apologizing for wounds I didn't cause. I wasn't going to waste another breath on justifying what had already been done. "I didn't do it for you," I said finally, not looking at her, not changing the rhythm of my movements. "And I didn't do it for them either. I did it for me." She scoffed, her laugh bitter and sharp, but she didn't push further. Maybe because she knew there was nothing else to say. Maybe because she realized, in that moment, that I hadn't just set fire to her version of the truth, I'd walked away from it completely. She stared at me for a few more seconds, trying to find something in my face to grab onto, something she could twist or challenge or break, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. I remained still, calm, untouchable in a way she had never seen me before. And eventually, she turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. The front door closed behind her with a finality that felt heavier than it should have, and the house was suddenly quiet again, almost eerily so. I stood there for a few minutes, leaning against the counter, listening to the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hiss of the radiator, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness settle into my bones. It was over, or at least, that part was. The storm had passed, but the wreckage still needed to be sifted through, and I wasn't sure yet what would be worth salvaging. Eventually, I returned to the living room to begin cleaning up the last bits of wrapping paper and crumpled napkins. The tree lights still twinkled quietly in the corner, casting soft reflections onto the windows, and for a moment, I let myself imagine what this night could have looked like in another life, one where love didn't come with conditions. Where family meant warmth instead of warfare, where I could sit at my own table without feeling like I was trespassing on someone else's legacy. That's when I saw it, a small box nestled beneath the tree, half hidden under a cushion that had been knocked to the floor. It hadn't been there earlier, at least not that I remembered, and for a second I thought it might have been left behind by mistake. I picked it up slowly, the weight of it delicate but significant, and saw my name written on the tag in familiar handwriting. It was from my mother. I hesitated before untying the ribbon, a knot forming in my chest that felt suspiciously like hesitation mixed with something dangerously close to hope. Inside the box was a brooch, vintage, gold-plated, intricate in design, something that once belonged to my grandmother and had always been promised to Rachel in every whispered conversation I'd overheard over the years. I lifted it from the tissue paper carefully, examining the delicate etching and the small ruby stone at its center, unsure whether to feel honored or insulted. Beneath the brooch was a folded piece of stationery, thick, cream-colored, the kind she used only for serious notes or long-overdue apologies. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat and deliberate, as if each letter had been considered before it touched the page. "I didn't mean for it to end this way." That was all it said. No explanation, no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just that one simple sentence, vague enough to be anything: guilt, manipulation, grief, or maybe just her version of closure. I stared at it for a long time, turning the words over in my mind like a puzzle with no solution, wondering what she had hoped I'd feel, what she had expected me to do with this final offering. And in that moment, I realized something that I hadn't been able to see before. Some things don't come with clear endings, and not every wound is meant to be stitched up neatly with ribbon and lace. Sometimes the healing is just the silence that follows, the breath you finally get to take without waiting for someone to take it from you. I held the note in my hand, stared at it for what felt like hours, then folded it neatly and slid it back into the box. Some gifts, I decided, are best left unopened, just like old wounds.